The story of a Chickasaw girl and her dream. In a world where dreams and girls are not always welcome.
We'll see if the Cardinals will be able to pull it off just one more time.
We won 88 games in a row and 2 national championships.
And the Cardinals have won the national championship.
And we got the Bums Rush twice.
This group is like none I've ever seen before.
Dreams die on basketball courts, just like anywhere else. But I never broke because of Mr. Bell, and because I'm Chickasaw.
88 Straight, available now from ChickasawPress.com.
Another exciting trailer from our production team. Welcome into the latest edition of Chickasaw Press Livestream. I'm your host, Larry Morgan, and today I'll be joined by our guest, Stanley Nelson, author of Totally, Chickasaw Stickball Then and Now, a historical Chickasaw atlas, and his latest release, 88 Straight. 88 Straight is our first young adult novel. It's set in Oklahoma during the Great Depression and follows the triumphs and tragedies of the young Chickasaw basketball star, Elizabeth Woodsy Pound. We're really excited to discuss this book today with Stan, and we look forward to you and your questions as you follow us along. Let's take it to Stan and start with some of our first questions for you. Stan, first off, thank you so much for being here with us today. For those that might not know, you have a long list of published works and writings, but this is your first foray into fiction. Were there any obstacles that you faced or that were unique to fictional writing while creating this book?
Well, it's based on history, and so it has a definite arc to it. It's something that we all know about and actually came about in Phil Morgan's book, Time in Chickasaw Women. So checking into that, using that as a template, it kind of pretty much dictates the story that we wrote. And it's not really my first foray into fiction. I actually have a nice stack of rejection letters and emails to prove that. I've written other fictional works, but this is my first fiction that's been published.
That's probably great news for these young writers to understand. It takes overcoming that to finally make it here. That's excellent.
Does.
Now, one of the unique pieces of this book is that it's set during the Great Depression. Did you run into any challenges recreating that time period where you yourself did not experience it firsthand?
Well, I didn't experience it firsthand in the sense that I lived through it, but my parents and their brothers and sisters, and my uncles and aunts, and my grandparents all lived through it. Some of my older cousins even lived through the Depression. And it wasn't so much, they did tell stories about the Depression. I did hear a lot about living during the Depression from them while I was growing up. As I say in the preface to the book, I wish I'd paid a lot more attention than I had. And I can't really recall too many stories, if any, that are in detail. But we'll say this, that I learned from them what life was like during the Depression, more from the attitudes they brought to life, whether it was to work or the relationships with each other, than the stories about the Depression itself. They tended to play down, the effects of the Depression in those stories, I think.
That's really interesting. Speaking of that, this book centers around the protagonist, Woodsy, who's a driven basketball player. Was there anything in particular that you enjoyed about crafting those scenes?
Well, one of the things that we have to remember is that in those days they played, especially women, played a very different sort of basketball from the type that they play today. It's really become a very different game. Back in those days, they played what's called 6-on-6, and we talk about it in the book. It's not like the 5-on-5 full court that we're very familiar with in these days. Okay, so checking into that and the reasons behind why they played that kind of game was very interesting. It revealed a lot about that culture in that time.
Excellent. I want to give a special shout out to Tisha Mingo. They're here with us today. We really appreciate you guys being here.
Hey guys.
Stan, with this book, you took on the task of writing it from a female first-person perspective. Was there anything about that proved difficult or, if not difficult, interesting for you?
Well, anytime that you write from a perspective that isn't your own, you have to be really very, very, very careful. I did use the characteristics of my mother as sort of a basis for it, but she wasn't the only one. And of course, I grew up, I had 3 sisters growing up, and I paid some attention, or I didn't try to seem like I wasn't paying too much attention, but I paid some attention to what they were like and what their attitudes were and how they handled certain things. And so that's pretty much the basis of what I had. Also, because I'm writing this in first person, using the point of view of the protagonist, Woodsy, that kind of allows us to create a character. And that character is the one through whose lens we actually see everything happen.
Wow, thank you, Stan. That's really interesting insight into how that works for you and as a writer. I know one of the important questions that many of our readers have, but that aren't familiar with the story, is the importance of the title. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit for them?
Right. 88 Straight, besides just that it kind of sings and rhymes within itself, looks at, it is significant of the record that Oklahoma Presbyterian College of Durant, which just out, well, I said it wrong, didn't I? Durant, here in Oklahoma, that's how you pronounce it, in those days set a record for 88 consecutive wins, 88 consecutive victories, and 2 AAU national championships. That's the American Athletic Union, and that's where a lot of women's basketball was played back in those days. So that's the significance of the title, and it's a record that stood for quite a few years.
That's amazing. And obviously this book, just based on its title and its type of book, it deals with lots of struggles and victories. How do you anticipate the reader to kind of change throughout this journey with Woodsy?
Well, it's some people would call it a book of triumph. I don't know that it depends on how you define triumph. Woodsy winds up actually coming to terms with a lot of things, and one of those things that she comes to terms with, of course, is her Chickasaw identity, which is a very important component of this book. And I should mention also that Woodsy, besides, even though she is the protagonist, she has 2 sisters who also play with her on the fictional Oklahoma Academy for Women team, and that these characters are based on the first chapter of Philip Carroll Morgan's wonderful book that came out in 2011 from Chickasaw Press, titled Dynamic Chickasaw Women, about the Hamilton sisters who came out of Colbert, Oklahoma. These sisters, Woodsy and her sisters, are based in Meade, Oklahoma, which happened to be my parents' hometown. So anyway, that's as far as how the reader changes. It is really a chronicle of a life. And very often when a reader reads a chronicle of a life, about somebody else's life, they wind up comparing and contrasting. And so it's going to be individual to each reader as to what they take away from 88 Straight.
Very true. And I love those personal tie-ins. Thank you so much for answering those initial questions for us, Stan. Let's head into overtime for our live signing and see what questions our readers have sent in for us today. And we'll remind everybody, if you're interested in purchasing 88 Straight or any other Chickasaw Press title, please visit us at chickasawpress.com or in person at 1020 North Mississippi Avenue in Ada, Oklahoma at our Chickasaw Press bookstore. And it looks like we have our first question here from Miss Tori Watson. She wants to know, did you have to do a lot of research into basketball, or were you already a big sports fan prior to this book?
Well, that's kind of a complex question, really. Am I a big sports fan? I am, in the sense that I am a huge baseball fan. That anybody who knows me knows that my favorite sport is and forever will be baseball. This book, as far as basketball is concerned, yes, I did have to do quite a great deal of deep research, not merely into basketball itself, but into basketball as it was played by women during that time. Very different game from what it is now, as we mentioned earlier. They would play what we call the 6-on-6 game, in which 3 members of each team were on either side of the center line of the court, and it was only the ball could pass over the center line. So that's a very brief and dissatisfying description of the game, but it was very different even from the game that men and boys played, which was 5-on-5 full court that we're familiar with today. So yes, I had to research not only into that, but also the reasons why that women and girls had to play that game, even on up into the 90s.
It's a very interesting point. Probably something that a lot of today's viewers may have not known before. So thank you for bringing that up. Another question here from Stacy. Stan, if Woodsy were here today, how would she feel about the advancements in women's sports since the era described within the book?
I think she'd have very mixed emotions, if you want to be honest, because we have just seen, for example, the reactions to the great gymnast Simone Biles and her decision not to participate in most of the events at the recent Olympics in Tokyo. And we've seen people have different attitudes toward female athletes that, to be frank, aren't a great deal different from what they were during that time period. So I think she would, for one thing, she'd be greatly pleased perhaps by the WNBA, the fact that there is a Women's National Basketball Association and that they are playing games, but she would have to point out that the crowds that go to those games aren't nearly as big as the crowds that go to the NBA games.
Absolutely. So some progress, maybe a little more. Thank you, Stan. We appreciate that. We have we have a book request from Mr. Graham Rowland. I want to say that right.
Yeah. All righty.
Excellent. And again, guys, anybody following us along on Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to send us your questions. We'll be happy to answer them. If you have a class that's following along in school, welcome. We appreciate you guys being here. Send us something from your class. We'll give you guys a shout out. Really appreciate you guys watching along with us today. And Stan, while you're writing that, I'm going to throw you another question here.
Sure.
Can you give us some background into your writing history, kind of your roots, and how we kind of come to be at this point as an author?
Well, to make a long story short, I spent 30 years in the newspaper business, but mostly as an editor. But I'd always wanted, ever since I was young, it's been so long, it's hard to remember how young, person, that I wanted to be a writer, and a writer of books specifically. So that's how long it's been. It's something I've always wanted to be, even while I was working in the newspaper business, and actually even during a particular time in the newspaper business, I figured that was all I was going to do with my life. But then came along Chickasaw Press, which of course owes its existence to Governor Bill Anatubby. And I managed to come to Chickasaw Press and begin work here. And in 2014, I became its senior staff writer. We have added a senior staff writer since then, so our tribe increases in that regard. But that's pretty much it in a nutshell, or as close to a nutshell as I can shove it into. So
that's perfect. We appreciate it, Stan. And as you continue to sign some more books, we had another question here from Zach. He wanted to know, what part of the book did you personally enjoy the most?
Probably the part, I know which one I enjoyed the most. I don't want to be a spoiler, but it's
spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert. But now I'm going to try not to spoil it. But there is a point during which Woodsy really gets one over on the people, the men who run, and it's an all-male group who run Oklahoma Academy for Women. And it's one of my favorite scenes in the book, one in which she actually leaves at least one of them terrified. So that's probably my favorite part of the book right there.
Excellent. You did a good job towing that line there. Thank you, Stan. We appreciate it. Stan, we have a question here from Tisha Mingo from a 3rd grade class. They want to know, and this may be even for some of our production team as well, where was the court that the trailer was shot at? And how about the uniform? Kind of how we got that? How was that acquired? We have it in the background here. We can take a little quick look at that.
Well, that you will have to ask the production team about that, because they told me and it just went in one ear and out the other.
Awesome. Give me a few seconds, guys, and I'll get that answer for us quickly. Great question, Nevaeh. We appreciate that. Another question here from Tiffany. How important is Woodsy's Chickasaw heritage for her?
It's a very interesting question, and one I'm glad to hear, because at the very beginning, her Chickasaw heritage, to her, as far as she's concerned, is accepted as a fact, but it's almost incidental to her. And it's only through interaction with her grandmother, who has to come to live with them after her mother leaves the family, that it begins to become important to her, but only through exposure to it that her grandmother leads her to. Her grandmother also passes during the book. I guess I'm spoiling it for some people, but at the end, it becomes a lot more important to her. She isn't finished in her journey by the time the book comes to an end. She isn't finished in that, but it is of great significance. It's of great significance to the story, and it is of increasing significance to Woodsy.
Excellent. Thank you, Stan. We do have an answer, guys. So the court that the trailer was in is in Pontotoc, Oklahoma, and it was shot at an Army Corps of Engineers original gym built in 1920. The uniform was custom made for the Chickasaw Press for this trailer. So we appreciate you guys catching that. And we really appreciate you guys noticing all the work that our production team puts in the trailers. We're very proud of that, and we hope you guys like it, and we really appreciate you guys enjoying that. Thank you. Now, Stan has mentioned earlier, the title refers to an 88-game winning streak that Woodsy's team had.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we kind of discussed the streak. It is real, and the college mentioned in the book is real. How long did that record stand for, and who broke that record?
I couldn't tell you exactly how long it stood for. I think it was in the 90s when the University of Connecticut Huskies broke it. I think they broke it by at least 10 wins or something like that. I don't really have those numbers in front of me. It may have been broken before that. I think there was actually, as I remember it now, there was a college in Texas that actually broke it. In the meantime, between OPC and the University of Connecticut team.
Excellent. Well, that's still a really long-standing record and run, and we're proud to discuss that and delve into that in this book. So thank you, Stan. We're going to keep checking Facebook, guys, for any additional questions that are coming along, and Stan's going to keep signing books. If anybody has a request, feel free to shout out and let us know. All right, we have Hartsarn here again today for the English class. We appreciate you guys being there. So Stan, we'll give him a shout out.
Hey, guys.
We have a question from the class. They want to know, did you have to study writing fiction before you started this, or was it just a learn as you go process?
It's a combination of both. I mean, you can go to different sources that will help you to learn about writing fiction. I did actually, like so many people do, I took a creative writing course, and the man who taught that course, Keith Copeland, also he's a novelist. He published Crofton's Fire back a few years back. It was about 2006, I believe, when it came out. Terrific novel. and one I read twice. I like a novel when I read it twice. But it's a combination really between teaching yourself and learning from different sources. And one thing about the internet, I've got to say, it does have a lot of good resources that one can go to learn more about writing, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction.
Absolutely. Use those works cited pages.
Yeah.
We have a question here from Cynthia, Stan. She wants to know, what advice could you give to inspiring writers out there that are interested in writing maybe a novel like 88 Straight?
Well, first of all, do your research, understand your subject, do the best you can as far as understanding what your subject is about, and be true and honest to it. And I actually have and sometimes share a compendium of advice for beginning writers, regardless of whether they're young. And one of those things, and you can look this up, is Kurt Vonnegut's 8 rules for writing fiction. It's generally for writing short fiction, but I find it applies to all fiction. And one of the best rules about it is that you got to write for just one reader. Write to please just one reader. That kind of gets you started on it. There's a great deal that has to be covered when we're talking about people who want to start writing.
That kind of segues perfectly into a question from one of our followers, Tina. She had a great question. For someone who is not interested in sports, how would you entice her to read this book?
Well, because this is not really, honestly, a book about basketball. It is a human drama with basketball as a backdrop. It's important to understand that, as far as basketball is concerned, it's a device within the novel. Yes, it is historically supported. Yes, this team really, or the team on which this team is based really did exist, and the college upon which this college is based really did exist. And a lot of the things that happened to this team really did happen in one way or another. But it could have been anything else. It could have been, a business or workplace environment where people have to more or less use a team approach, or a collection of individuals who don't work well together as a team. It could have been, some other sport, or it could have been any other more or less human endeavor or collective endeavor. It's just a way of bringing people together and putting them in a situation where things happen and human drama happens. So that's what basketball is really about in this novel. The basketball is not what attracted me to write 88 Straight. What attracted me was the cultural pressures that these young women had to work under. First, for being females, then for being female athletes. And the third one is one that I more or less introduced at a higher level maybe than was present in the true historical basis for this. And that was being first American female athletes. In this case, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and whoever.
Thank you, Stan. Stan, we're going to let you sign a few more books here real fast. But we're going to take a quick look at the cover.
We wish.
Absolutely. Our graphics team did an amazing job on this cover. We're really proud of it. And it complements the work that our video production team did on the trailer. So thank you guys for watching. We hope you like this as well. And looks like we have the hardest question that an author or a reader can answer. For those of you that don't know Stan, Stan is an avid reader and one of the most well-read individuals that I've ever met. And they wanted to know what your favorite book was. And we know that is the hardest question to answer.
It's a hard question to answer because I don't know that I have a favorite book. I do have books that I hold in high regard, and there are even some books that I've read multiple times. I know how trite this may sound, but honestly, there's one book that I've read 4 times in different versions, and that's the Bible. It is probably one of the most underrated books when it comes to the understanding of how much it means to our literary culture. It is probably the basis of the literary culture that we work with here at the press and everywhere else in the United States. Just about every other storytelling matter that you see in a book somehow comes from that. Remember, we're about 4 centuries away from when it was first published in English on a public basis, but that's the one that I look forward to, or look toward most often, very often, as a matter of fact. As far as I can name all sorts of books and authors that I've read and enjoyed, but I couldn't say that I would pick out an absolute favorite. This is the book that I've got to read every year, sort of thing.
Thank you, Stan. We really appreciate that. I think we kind of touched on this earlier, but we just want to kind of clarify for our followers. How did you first kind of come into contact with the story? Was it by reading Dynamic Women, or was it anything before then?
Well, actually, I didn't just read Dynamic Chickasaw Women. I was Philip Carroll Morgan's principal editor on the project. I guess you could say I was personal editor too. But anyway, that's how I became familiar with the background and the history of 88th Street. And I told Phil, actually, from the moment that I started editing this work, I told him and hounded him for 2 years to write this novel. I said, Phil, you're the one to write it, because you're the one who's done all the background research. You're the one who's got all the materials you need. And it took about 3 years of my hounding, 2 years of that, of my hounding after him to write it, before he finally said, well, why don't you write it? And so the rest is, as they say, fiction.
Exactly. Historical fiction in this case.
I would call it historical fiction if it didn't take some licenses. For example, there is one person who did show up in Phil's account in Dynamic Chickasaw Women, his account of the Hamilton sisters. That was the great Depression era female athlete Babe Didrikson. But then there's another person who shows up in there who's famous during that time also, or you might say infamous, who wasn't in that account. So, and I'm going to leave the reader to discover that.
We have a great process question here, Stan. Kelsey wants to know, were there any differences between writing fiction and nonfiction with your process? And what were your favorite parts of each?
Well, every time that if you're writing fiction, honestly, I find writing fiction more difficult, because sometimes nonfiction, if I can use the term, just gets weirder than fiction. That's one of the things that I tell young writers is, don't be afraid to be weird when you're writing. Don't be afraid to let the story get weird, because the weirder the story is, actually more often than not, the more human it is. So creating those weird ideas in fiction is, you feel like you're kind of jumping off a ledge or something, and you don't know when your feet are going to hit bottom. In nonfiction, however, it's already been done because somebody actually already really did it. And that's one of the big differences. So, it's sometimes a similarity.
We really appreciate that. I know Stan's going to continue to sign books here. We appreciate everybody who decided to join us today. Stan, thank you so much. We're going to keep this going, guys.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys. Thanks to Shamingo.
Thanks to everybody else for taking the time to be with us today. If you're interested in purchasing 88 Straight or any other Chickasaw Press titles, please be sure to visit us at chickasawpress.com or in person at 1020 North Mississippi Avenue in Ada, Oklahoma at our Chickasaw Press bookstore. Please join us tomorrow as we speak with Mike and Martha Larson as they discuss their recent release, Listening to Our Elders. Until next time, Chapiza la Cho.